They didn't hold rifles, they held bandages, telephones, and trembling hands. They weren't on the front line. They were the front line, holding what was left of men torn by war. When the guns fell silent, their stories were often forgotten, yet their courage was quieter, deeper, and more enduring than any uniformed soldiers. This is the war seen through those who fought without weapons, the women who stayed when everyone else ran. Fact 1. The blood on her hands. In 1944, in a field hospital outside Caen, France, a 23-year-old British nurse named Margaret Price spent 3 days without sleep. She'd been told to evacuate, but the convoy was full. Around her, the wounded whispered for morphine, for water, for their mothers. The air reeked of iron and smoke. Her gloves had long since torn, so she worked barehanded, her fingers stained red. When a German prisoner begged her not to die alone, she whispered back, "You're not my enemy tonight." In the chaos of collapsing front lines, compassion became defiance. Her service record listed her as voluntary assistant, but soldiers remembered her as the one who never left. Fact 2. The voice in the static. Hundreds of miles away, in a cold wooden hut in Belarus, a 19-year-old Soviet radio operator named Katya Petrova tapped out coordinates under candlelight. The sound of German boots echoed in the village below. She could hear them through the walls. Her orders were clear: transmit until captured. The machine crackled, then jammed. She rewired it with trembling hands, sent the final code, and smashed the key as the door burst open. She didn't scream when they dragged her out. Later, her comrades heard her message arrive, clean, complete, and perfectly timed. The artillery she called saved an entire battalion. Her name was never written in any official report, only a signal that ended with 3 letters. All done. Fact 3. The white flag that wasn't. In 1945, as Allied troops entered a ruined German town, they saw a white cloth waving from a shattered church. Expecting surrender, they entered cautiously, but inside were no soldiers, only a group of Red Cross volunteers tending to civilians and even wounded Wehrmacht men. The one who led them, Sister Agnes, had refused to flee when the front collapsed. Her bandages were made from torn altar cloths, her medicine nearly gone. When a soldier asked her why she hadn't escaped, she said simply, "Someone had to stay and see what mercy looks like." In a war built on hatred, that small act of defiance became its own victory. Fact 4. The last train out of Warsaw. When the German army entered Warsaw in 1939, a Polish nurse named Irena Majewska was ordered to evacuate with the last Red Cross train heading east. But at the station, she saw mothers with infants and wounded soldiers denied boarding because they had no papers. She tore up her own ticket and gave her seat to a boy who couldn't walk. That night, she hid inside the baggage car, tending to the wounded as bombs fell along the tracks. When the train derailed near Brest, she crawled through fire to pull strangers to safety. For 3 days, she worked without food or orders, just instinct. Decades later, one of those she saved wrote in his memoir, "She was the only calm thing in a world burning apart." Fact 5. The letter that never reached home. In the winter of 1942, deep inside the snowy forests of Karelia, a Finnish field nurse named Aino wrote a letter to her husband. "The men here call me mother," she said. but I'm only 24. Her hands were frostbitten. The tent's temperature was below freezing. She melted snow over a small stove to clean wounds that would not stop bleeding. The next morning, the hospital came under shell fire. She shielded a wounded conscript with her own body. The letter, burned at the edges, was found later among her things. The last line read, "If I do not come back, know that I wasn't afraid, only cold." Fact 6. The signal that saved the convoy. In North Africa, under the glare of a burning desert sun, British Auxiliary Territorial Service operator Elsie Morton worked inside a canvas tent filled with radios and dust. When the Germans began shelling the supply convoy, her lines went dead. She crawled out, bullets snapping overhead, found a shattered cable, and held it together with her bare hands long enough to send a single message: ambush ahead. The transmission took 5 seconds. The convoy halted just in time. Her palms were burned black by the current. Later that day, when her commanding officer found her unconscious, she had a smile on her face. Her radio log ended with 2 words underlined twice: message sent. Fact 7. The Room of Silence. In a bombed-out hospital in Berlin, a young German nurse named Lotte Engel learned that the war was over before anyone told her. The wounded stopped shouting. The artillery stopped roaring. Only the wind remained, moving through the broken windows. She had tended both soldiers and civilians, hiding Jewish children under linen carts when SS officers came to inspect. That morning, she washed the blood from her hands in a cracked basin and whispered, "It's finished." In her diary, later found by Allied medics, she wrote, "We were told the fatherland would last 1,000 years. It lasted only long enough to make us old." She wasn't bitter, just empty. And that emptiness was her victory. Fact 8. The Island of Shadows. In the Pacific, a Japanese nurse named Hanae Sato was trapped on a small island after the American landings in 1945. The officers had fled. The wounded soldiers begged her to end their suffering, but she refused. She scavenged rainwater, boiled roots, and used torn uniforms as bandages. For weeks, she hid them in caves from both armies. When American Marines finally found her, she stood up, slowly, hands raised, expecting execution. Instead, a medic saluted her and offered water. She cried, not from fear, but from disbelief. In her notebook, she later wrote, "I was ready to die, but they treated me like a nurse." Fact 9. The Night of the Blackout. London, 1941. The Blitz had turned the city into a breathing inferno. Ambulances couldn't move, and the air raid sirens were useless. There was no pause between bombings. In the darkness, Nurse Evelyn Clark tied a white sheet around her arm so the others could find her in the smoke. She worked out of a shattered underground station using candlelight to stitch wounds. The ceiling shook. Dust fell into open gashes. At one point, she ran out of morphine and began humming to the injured to calm them. Old lullabies her mother had sung. A soldier later said he didn't remember the pain, only the sound of her voice through the explosions. For the rest of her life, she refused to talk about those nights. "It wasn't courage," she said once. "It was habit and fear mixed together." Fact 10. The messenger who never carried a gun. In occupied France, 17-year-old Colette Marchand rode her bicycle from village to village carrying coded messages for the resistance. Hidden inside her breadbasket were slips of paper, coordinates, names, and sometimes morphine ampules for wounded partisans. She was stopped 3 times by German patrols. Once she pretended to be crying over a broken loaf of bread. They laughed and let her go. Her brother died in the Maquis. She kept delivering messages the next day. She never fired a bullet. Her weapon was her face. Young, harmless, invisible. After the war, when asked how she survived, she said, "They never looked at me long enough to see I was dangerous." Fact 11. The Prayer Under the Rubble. Naples, 1943. An Allied bombing raid struck a hospital, burying patients and nurses under concrete and glass. One of them, Sister Lucia Romano, a nun turned medic, was trapped in a collapsed hallway with 6 wounded soldiers. She could not move the rubble, so she prayed, not for rescue, but for time. For 36 hours she spoke softly to keep them awake, told them stories of her childhood, sang old hymns. When rescuers finally broke through, they found her still talking, her voice barely a whisper. 2 of the men had survived because she'd pressed their wounds with her own hands until help came. Her first words outside the wreck were, "Please, let me wash." Not herself, the blood from those she couldn't save. Fact 12. The Bridge of the Dying. On the retreat from Burma in 1942, British and Indian troops crossed a jungle bridge rotting under monsoon rain. Behind them marched Sister Nora Ellison, one of the few nurses who hadn't been evacuated. She carried morphine in one pocket, letters from the dying in another. The trail was lined with the sick and abandoned, malaria, hunger, exhaustion. She stopped for each one, whispering the same words, "You are seen." When she finally reached the Indian border, barefoot and delirious, she refused treatment until someone went back for the wounded. Later, when asked why she didn't leave with the others, she replied, "Because no one writes history about the ones left behind." Fact 13. The Snow That Burned. Eastern Front, January 1943. The Red Army was retreating through a blizzard so thick it erased the world. Among them was field medic Tatiana Kovalenko, 19, small, stubborn. Her boots had frozen stiff, her breath turning white before her eyes. She dragged the wounded on makeshift sleds made from doors torn off houses. The snow turned crimson where she worked. When her stretcher bearers collapsed, she went back alone for the last man, a German soldier who could no longer move. She wrapped him in her own coat and whispered, "Don't die here. Not like this." The next day, both were found alive, huddled together in a trench of ice. No one ever knew which side she'd saved him for. Fact 14. The Station That Never Slept. In a small station near Moscow, telegraph operator Galina Orlova worked 20-hour shifts sending supply orders for the front. The trains came and went, the walls shook, but she stayed at her desk, headphones pressed to her ears, fingers bleeding from the cold metal keys. When enemy planes bombed the station, she refused to leave her post. She had to warn the next train carrying wounded men. "They can't stop here," she shouted over the roar. "They'll die if they stop." Moments later, the platform exploded. The train passed through without halting. The next morning, she was found unconscious but alive beneath the wreckage. Her fingers still clutched to the transmitter. Her last transmission was 3 words: "Track still clear." Fact 15. The Girl Who Carried the Light. In the ruins of Saint-Lô, Normandy, 1944, A 22-year-old American Army nurse named Grace Whitmore refused to evacuate after her field hospital was destroyed by artillery. At night, she moved through the shattered rooms with a lantern, finding the living among the dead. The soldiers called her the Ghost because only her light could be seen through the smoke. She didn't notice her own shrapnel wound until dawn. When another nurse tried to take over, Grace simply said, "I can still see. That's enough." Years later, she never spoke about the war, only the lantern she kept on her shelf. When asked why, she said, "It was never mine. I just carried it until morning came." Fact 16. The woman who refused to kneel. In the Philippines, 1942, when Japanese troops stormed a Red Cross outpost near Bataan, Nurse Josefina Guerrero stood in their path. She was frail, suffering from leprosy, but her disease became her armor. The soldiers recoiled, unwilling to touch her. Behind her, the wounded escaped through the jungle. When the invaders demanded information, she simply smiled and said, "You fear what you can't kill." Later, she smuggled maps of Japanese positions to American forces by sewing them inside her bandages. She became known as the leper spy. When the war ended, she didn't celebrate. She went back to caring for those disfigured like herself. Her body was scarred, but her spirit untouchable. Fact 17. The hospital under the stairs. Warsaw, August 1944. In a tenement basement lit by a single bulb, a young Home Army nurse turned a coal room into an operating ward. The door was a stretcher. A piano lid became a table. Shells shook dust from the ceiling, turning gauze grey. She wrote names on forearms with carpenter's pencil because tags kept getting lost. When the morphine ran out, she pressed a wounded boy's face to her shoulder and whispered the Our Father into his hair. Outside, the street was a furnace. Inside, she kept time with a watch that had stopped, counting breaths, not minutes. When the position finally fell, she led the walking wounded through a hole in the wall. She looked back once, memorized the room, and said, "So someone will remember where courage lived." Fact 18. The line that wouldn't die. Telemark, Norway, winter 1943. A switchboard operator named Astrid kept the resistance network breathing. German patrols prowled the snowdrifts. Phones clicked with strange listens. When saboteurs signaled they were in place, the exchange went dark. Cut lines, frozen relays. Astrid ran into the storm with a coil of wire and a pair of pliers, following poles like a rosary. She spliced in the wind, fingers numb, teeth holding a nail as a makeshift clamp. The moment the circuit hummed, she ducked behind a stone fence and tapped the single word they needed. Go. Minutes later, explosions rolled across the valley. The heavy water plant crippled. Back at her board, she kept routing calls until dawn, blood on the ear pads where frost had split her skin. Her logbook entry for that night? Service maintained. Fact 19. The boat with no lanterns. Burma, 1944. On a moonless river, a narrow wooden boat slid past mangrove shadows. At the oar was Li Mei, a Chinese nurse attached to a field unit on the Burma Road. The outpost had fallen. The only way out for the wounded was water. Lanterns would draw fire, so she steered by the sound of reeds and the smell of wet earth. Every few minutes she checked pulses, kept pressure on a chest wound with her knee, and hummed a folk song to time the rowing. Once a flare turned the river to daylight. She froze, hand over a soldier's mouth, until darkness returned. By dawn, they reached a bend guarded by Indian troops who thought they were ghosts. When they lifted the stretcher, Li Mei finally let go of the oar. Her palms were raw, but the boat and the men had made it. Fact 20. The names in the jar. Occupied Poland, 1942. Posing as a district nurse, a quiet woman carried vaccine cards and a canvas bag. Inside were bandages and blank birth certificates. She visited the ghetto clinic by day and the orphanage by night, teaching babies new names in whispers, smuggling them through gates in laundry carts and ambulance crates. Before each rescue, she wrote the child's real name on a slip of paper, sealed it in wax, and hid it in a glass jar beneath an apple tree. So they can find themselves after the war, she told the few who dared to ask. One evening, the patrols came early. She swallowed the forged lists, smiled through the questioning, and walked out slower than she wanted to run. Years later, when the jars were dug up, the papers were smudged but legible, proof that a weapon can be nothing more than memory, carefully kept. Fact 21. The Angel in Bastogne, Belgium, December 1944. Snow fell like ash as the Battle of the Bulge closed its fist around Bastogne. In a cellar lit by candles stuck in broken bottles, a Belgian nurse named Renée Lemaire moved from stretcher to stretcher, speaking French to the locals and halting English to the Americans. Supplies were gone. She tore sheets into bandages and warmed morphine with her hands. On Christmas Eve, a bomb found the aid station. Flames chased the air from the room. Renée dragged 2 men to the stairs before the floor collapsed. They called her the Angel of Bastogne, a name she never heard. Outside, the town kept breathing because people like her refused to stop. In the rubble the next day, a medic found her scissors fused into a single bright blade. Fact 22. The gloves in the drawer. Years after the war, a retired nurse lived alone in a quiet town, any town. Her medals stayed in a shoebox. Her stories stayed mostly unspoken. On winter evenings, she opened the same drawer and touched a pair of cracked rubber gloves, a whistle on a frayed lanyard, and a small notebook with names written in pencil, some crossed out, some circled twice. When neighbors asked what she did back then, she would smile and say, "I kept people company." In truth, she had done more than that. She had held the line without a weapon, stitch by stitch, breath by breath, until morning finally came. The drawer closed with a soft click, and the house fell quiet, like a field hospital after the last lamp goes dark. Wars end with signatures, but they're survived by hands. These women used theirs to lift, to steady, to remember. In the long silence after the guns, that's what remains.